Um, really want to thank you, Stephen, for spending some time with us this afternoon. Knowing that you're going on vacation or something this week, so I apologize for grabbing you, but I appreciate it. And we've got a couple of folks online that are from the studying the task force for studying corporate ownership of housing. And both your article as well as just, I guess, through connections, we had found you. And so at the last meeting, everyone had asked to see if you wouldn't mind talking about some of the research that you've done. Really big picture is to find out what you've learned in that, and then any helpful hints that we might glean from that in terms of understanding maybe what's going on in Colorado. So with that, I'll turn it over to you to do a better introduction of yourself, and your area of expertise and what you're working on, and then to go forward with your slides or presentations, and then we'll stop and do some Q&A at the end.
Perfect. Thanks so much for having me. So I'm Stephen Billings. I'm actually a professor of real estate at University of Colorado in Boulder. I've been kind of back and forth from Colorado for the last 25 years. I spent some time in Denver, and I've also been at Boulder since 2016. So one of my kind of past stints was at the University of North Carolina, Charlotte. So today I'll talk a little bit about some research using data from Charlotte. And the reason you'll kind of see why this works well is because in terms of corporate ownership of what I would call single-family housing, traditionally single-family ownership housing, Charlotte is one of the areas that's had some of the most intense activity. One of the things you'll also find is that we just don't really know very well where a lot of this is happening. So that's one of the big lifts here in thinking about this. So I'm going to kind of just give you kind of a heads up. I'm going to go over kind of bigger questions in this area and then talk very specifically some of the stuff I find in my research, kind of end with a little bit of what I think are some potential policy implications. But this is a relatively new research agenda for me. So if you guys have some insight or if I'm missing some things, definitely let me know. Usually in these type of talks in general, I get interrupted all the time. So if you have a question and other people probably have questions too, it's better just interrupt me because that's the clearest way to kind of move forward. So it's not rude in my world. Everyone does it all the time. So feel free to just interrupt me, just shout out, or if you want to raise your hand, that's fine too. And I'll try to address it, but just let me know. But let me get started here and provide a little bit, probably 20, 30-minute kind of presentation on this. Okay. Just do a little housekeeping here to move people around. All right. Okay. So the rise of institutional investors in residential real estate. So a lot of these results will actually come from joint work with one of my co-authors, Adam Solomon, who's just finished his PhD and is a postdoc at LSE and will be in Clemson in the fall. So we'll probably have other projects as we move forward, but let's just kind of start off. I assume, you guys know a lot of this, but I'm just going to kind of frame this as what we know and what people think about this story. So one thing we've seen in the data and from talking with lots of people is that since the Great Recession, so since 2008, we've seen this kind of real uptick in this institutional investor entry into real estate. Okay, this is quite different. There's not really any good evidence that this has been going on very much prior to this at all. And we know that there was just tons of single family homes available initially through lots of foreclosures. But when we get into some of the other analysis, we'll talk about the more current context. It's not really a foreclosure story anymore. Okay, it's really more of a traditional, regularly transacted single family homes. And so there's lots of tight credit. So that stops individual home buyers, but favors people who don't need mortgages. And, there's become some automation and some ability to lower some of these overhead costs and transaction costs. And so just to be clear what the strategy is for most institutional investors, from what I've talked, when I'm talking with people in this area, what they've said, and actually I'm going to be talking to some more institutional investors in the next couple of weeks to get even more information on this, but overall, it's typically a story of cash offers, quick closings, and conversion of what are traditionally ownership homes and often the lowest the lowest price and income categories to income producing rentals. Okay, so you should really think about these corporate landlords are typically buying stuff that's where some of the first homes people buy in their life. So really those starter homes, and they'll turn them into rentals. The reason the kind of what's going on in terms of the finance side is that they're taking these income flows and they're making them part of these real estate investment trusts. And so if you know kind of anything about this space, the strategy is this. I want to make sure I do this quickly. I get a quick close. I quickly convert it to income producing rentals, and I get that income flow to be very consistent. So that way, when I get people to invest in it and get returns from it, they'll have great faith that they're going to get this nice regular return from it. So that attracts more investors to bring more money into these REITs, and this continues to provide more funds to buy more homes. So it's kind of a self-perpetuating cycle a little bit, which is kind of interesting. Here's a snapshot of this article. I was working with a lot of people in North Carolina for my research, but there's been countless stories of this throughout many states, and we'll talk about some of these other places where it's happening. It's also Colorado being one of them. And so it's been actually it's been showing really good returns. So Wall Street is definitely interested in investing more in this. So the returns have been very high. So it's attracting lots of funds. But before we, frame it in either a positive or negative light, it's not necessarily that it's a good or a bad thing, right? So we're pretty open to this idea that maybe this is a good thing. We have institutional investors, so these investors are buying homes. Maybe I was having trouble selling my home and now someone will buy it. That's good. That provides, money for people to sell their homes. They want to move somewhere else, tap out their equity. Those are all positive things in lots of ways. So it's liquidity for these homeowners. The other thing it does, and there's some other people doing research in this space, and I might do some more myself, is that, typically renters aren't allowed in these neighborhoods in the past, right? We think of a suburban neighborhood, all ownership, single family housing. And we know there's lots of zoning and housing restrictions just based on development restrictions, that maybe a renter can access a neighborhood with better amenities, less crime, more parks, better schools. So this could have some real benefits for people. Some of the negatives we might think come up, and a lot of this comes from some of these articles that have been written, which have been overwhelmingly in a negative light. So, maybe that's more of the experience for people, but that's why we do the research, to see if that's just anecdotal or more of a real trend. So one thing you do see is that in general, the prices, and I'll show you in my analysis too, the prices that institutional investors for pretty much similar homes is a little bit lower. So that doesn't mean it's a bad thing, because if they're paying a lower price, but maybe they're doing all these other things that make the sale more attractive to the seller. They're using cash, they're doing it quickly, they're not requiring home repairs. Well, that's going to be a real benefit, right, to potentially a seller, because they don't want the deal to fall through, and they also don't want to make repairs. And there's no mortgage contingency or sales contingencies or anything else that might slow up a transaction. But once these prices get lower, that makes the comps lower. So then there's an issue of that most comps don't take into account some of the nature of the transaction very well. And so often we'll see these kind of market comps that determine future valuation or future sales prices impacted by this. So that could have a negative spiral effect on neighborhood prices. The corporate structure can mean there's lots of anecdotal evidence that there's lots of cost cutting in terms of maintenance repairs. So they're doing more minimal kind of maintenance repairs that maybe a mom and pop or a single owner, just a local landowner, a landlord would do. They're also quite aggressive in evicting people. So that has another issue that we're maybe worried about. They're just using the eviction system a little bit too much, in the sense they're not giving people more of a chance to stay in housing. One thing which we'll look at really which I look at more in my research, is how neighborhoods change as these corporate landlords buy these homes, convert them. Okay. And I'm going to think about this. I want you to think about it too, is that we are taking homes that are typically been ownership, and we're making them rental properties. And this strategy, of course, the institutional investors are going to do this. They're going to keep these rentals for, a prolonged period of time. We don't find much evidence that even of some of the earlier investors in our time frame ever go back to just selling the property later on. I'm sure over time we'll start to see that as these REITs change their allocation of capital, they might start to divest from some of these homes. So that could have an interesting implication too. If we see one of these REITs just mass sale off on properties, that could have some potential impacts too. But we're not at that time period yet, at least in our data. Okay, so that's another New York Times kind of article or tweet about this story. Okay. So some of the big questions we've been thinking about, and I'm sure you guys have been thinking about, is what is the actual scale of institutional investors purchasing homes since the Great Recession? The reality is, and I'll show you in a little while, why this is actually a really hard question just to answer. We have raw numbers on some of what these institutional investors are doing, but not even all of them, because some are public and some are privately owned. And we just don't even know just what that scale and how much has changed over time. So I'll talk about that story in a little bit. We're also interested in what are the impacts on home ownership and home prices. Okay. So and also, are there some racial implications, some equity issues in the story? Right. And we'll also talk about what I talk about mostly in the research so far that myself and Adam have been doing is how have neighborhoods been impacted by institutional purchases? Okay, that's just one question of many that we could look at, but it's one that we were able to, I think, answer fairly well. So that's why we kind of approached it. Okay. So some of the big challenges you're going to find in this space, and in doing this for Colorado, you're going to find this to be a big challenge also, is that just identifying which homes are purchased by institutional investors. And there's lots of techniques and kind of ownership records that obfuscate the actual ownership. So using lots of LLCs, and I'll show you some examples of this in a minute, and make it really hard to figure out if it's an institutional investor or maybe a local developer or someone who's flipping homes. And these are all different things that we want to treat differently for thinking about impacts. Okay. There's lots of impacts that we could think about also in terms of what are the impacts on home prices and also rents as we see these ownership units being converted to rental units. Okay, this should broadly impact the market. Maybe more rentals available will decrease rents in some meaningful way. That could be good. Maybe it's also impacting prices in some meaningful way. And so we want to know that, but we also want to know, is this leading to neighborhoods to change fundamentally? Okay. And we'll even talk about some elements that certain types of neighborhoods are being affected differently than others. Okay. All right. Let me just give me a little bit more landscape, and then let's see if you guys have any questions. So this is what I could figure out. I mean, these are some of the 6 biggest players that I've found, at least in the Charlotte. I can't tell you the reality of what it looks like in other places, but based on their public information. So any of these that's a public REIT, so it's any of these are public REITs, you can get a lot more information on them. The private ones are a lot harder to figure out what they're doing. They're not required to disclose this information. And so, but this gives you a sense of what's going on. In general, a lot of them are in the same states, but we're talking, players that are approaching 100,000 homes each. So getting quite sizable. And these numbers are probably smaller than reality, as these numbers are what they posted from maybe a couple of years ago even. And so, you'll see the states on here. I mean, almost all of them have properties in Colorado, except for Tricon didn't look like it did. And Amherst, I just don't know which states they're talking about. But you can see that they tend to be, a lot of them in the Carolinas, Georgia, Florida, Texas, overwhelmingly all of them are in those states. And then, we see some in the Southwest, Nevada. So a lot of these places that I would say have large suburban developments, because that's really what they want. And I'll talk about that in a little bit too, is that the target for these institutional investors is a very specific housing stock. And that's important because if you really think about where they're going to concentrate their activities, it's going to be pretty spatially concentrated in areas that have that desirable homes that don't need lots of repairs, homes that are not brand new but not too old, homes that are in these kind of not really big homes because those get a little expensive, and so you'll see lots of kind of these different stories. Okay. So that's just the national, and I can speak more on what what I found in my stuff. But is there any questions just on that kind of national stuff or anything you guys want to add about your experience or understanding of this national landscape of institutional investors? Like my students, if you don't say anything, I'll just keep going. Um, so I won't call on you like I do my students though, because no one likes that really. Anyway, so my research has been focused on one area in Charlotte. And mostly there's a lot of this is data constraints and just time constraints, but the idea is to hopefully expand it to other states. And so that's something we'd love to do. It's just a matter of getting the resources and to fund time to get RAs to do some of this work because it is time consuming. So what we did in North Carolina was we did go through all the administrative records to identify institutional investors in North Carolina. And I'll show you a little bit in a second how that worked. We're going to use lots of other administrative records, and why we want to use all these data sets is because we want to say something meaningful about how neighborhoods are impacted by this activity and this conversion from ownership to rental properties. And so we're going to lean on what a lot of literature talks about as the social spillovers of home ownership. So we know there's lots of policies that incentivize or subsidize home ownership, the tax code being one of the largest elements of that. And so the question is, do these types of this type of activity, does that have an impact on some of these potential social spillovers that people have from owning a home, investing in their neighborhood and community? We'll talk about different price effects and local spillovers from conversions to rentals. And then, this analysis, what we're gonna do is look very spatially, very granular. Okay. And there's a couple of reasons. One is that it's hard to disentangle the types of neighborhoods that institutional investors move into and purchase homes from other neighborhood characteristics. So if we look at very small spatial scale, we can compare properties, right next door to these institutional investments, and then look a little further away, which people may not be affected. It's unlikely you would know that a home was purchased by an institutional investor unless they were probably right near you. It's just not, there's nothing that's going to be so apparent. Okay. So kind of big trends, what we see. So we're going to focus on this 2011 through 2021 because there's really almost no activity before that in the data. Okay. And I've heard that's fairly common for most parts of the country. About 7% of all single family homes were purchased by institutional investors. And that's actually a sizable amount if you start to think about it. So you want to think about institutional investors as often in this context, in this time period, they're not going to auction buying foreclosures. That is not the model you should be thinking about. You should be thinking about often they will have hire agents and work with the real estate community and just buy whatever's available on the market at different time periods. Often what happens is they get a big chunk of money as investors put money into these REITs, and then they want to kind of spend the money quickly so they can start showing returns from it. And so they'll get a big chunk of money and buy whatever available. So that's how you should think about their transactions. They're not soliciting, they're not giving flyers out, say, please sell me your home for cash, and none of that is what's going on. Okay. If we look at the neighborhoods that really target, it's really 12%. So they are spatially quite targeted, and I'll show you that in a minute. And the one thing that's, I think, really interesting, and it's not clear to me, it has an actual racial kind of, it's like explicitly racial in nature, but the trend is that institutional investors overwhelmingly invest in minority neighborhoods. Okay. In Charlotte, if you look at the kind of time frame, this is kind of a lot of the suburban neighborhoods that have homes built in the 90s and 2000s, which is the target of the institutional investors. They are often overwhelmingly African American, and that is due to the fact that the gentrification of more inner city neighborhoods pushed out a lot of African Americans to these more suburban neighborhoods as prices and so on got higher and higher inside the city. So, this is a little bit of this story of just the time that other urban changes that are going on. But there is some element that it could also be there's some racial, like something about the characteristics of those neighborhoods. Institutional purchases are typically cheaper, so they're paying less for what are observationally equivalent homes, even in the same neighborhood. So 2 homes, same neighborhood, one purchased by an institutional investor, one purchased by a more traditional owner, you will see that 4% cheaper for those institutional purchasers. Okay. But that could just be because they're paying cash and not requiring repairs and things like that. We do see some movement in home ownership rates. If we look at existing housing stock, because remember, they're not buying new homes, so these are existing homes. We will see the actual decline in home ownership rates if you just kind of base measuring on existing housing stock. Now, there could be new stuff being built that's for renters or for owners throughout the whole bigger urban area, but at least in these areas, we will definitely be seeing a loss of home ownership. Okay. Yes. Go ahead, Tio.
And you go by Stephen?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
Perfect. Well, thank you, Stephen. First of all, thank you for your paper. I thought it was wonderful. We did have a question with regard to the transactions in which the purchaser was a corporate entity, as compared to transactions where the seller was a corporate entity. So obviously, you put the case there are that corporate entities are only buying and never selling. Then obviously there'd be an accumulation over time. But we haven't yet seen a data source that talks about the back end of that, the liquidation of those assets, the resale of previously held corporate entities. Does your data look at that, or do you have any thoughts as to how we might be able to measure the overall stock as opposed to just the flow?
Yeah, so the same way we measure them buying, and we can see them selling it for sure, for sure. Now, we spent a little time initially, did not see much sales going on. We pretty much overwhelmingly, I mean, you know, at least in our study period, and like more than 90% were bought and never sold in that time frame. So it got to the point, for at least for statistical reasons, we didn't have enough data to say anything about the disposition or the sale of these by these corporate entities. I do think it's an interesting point. I do think it's something we will see as we expand this nationally, we will try to analyze that side of it for sure.
Okay. And when you're talking about that you didn't see the sales, my understanding is that about you said that there were about 80% of the transactions you looked at were between like 6 major corporate entities. So is it possible it's just simply those corporate entities have a tendency to hold as opposed to other investors who would sell, like a closed-end private equity fund, for example?
Absolutely. We kind of wanted to focus on a group that was quite similar and had this kind of similar business model. So, because, you know, if they're doing other things, let's say they're doing flips, let's say they're doing kind of like these quick, like sometimes I call them like lipstick on a house, whatever. They kind of clean it up and they sell it real quickly because they found something they thought was undervalued, try to make a quick dollar off of it. That is not as kind of interesting in our context because it's not changing fundamentally much about the neighborhood. It's just like a quick, they sell it, someone buys it, lives there. So that wasn't our focus, but I mean, it would be quite doable to identify those people in our data. So all these things, all these different ways of characterizing how properties change and evolve over time, absolutely you can do it in these data sets. Okay. The one thing that's hard to know is if someone, like, so sometimes people buy a house, they might sit for a while, they might rent it, and then, but never, like, it's sometimes it's hard to know if there's always a renter in there or if it's vacant or if it's being rehabbed, and the timing of that can be hard to disentangle.
All right.
Cool.
Thank you.
Great question. Okay. So because I'm an economist and we're always doing, oh, Heidi, yes, go for it, Heidi.
Yeah, just really quickly, on your prior slide, when you look at the homeownership drop, is it 2 percentage points rather than 2%? The 2 and the 4?
Yeah, percentage points.
Okay.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yep. Good question. Okay. And that's actually pretty, if you ever look at like home ownership rates across time in the best since like, post World War II, where we really saw this massive uptick as the secondary mortgage markets came into play. Even like 2-4%, that's a big change. Usually it doesn't evolve or change that quickly. So it's meaningful. Okay.
And is that statistic, yeah. If I just note, so that's your findings are that in those neighborhoods you observed a 2% increase as opposed to as a result of the buying activity of these 6 major corporate firms has caused that. It's just that those coincided.
Well, it's mechanical, right? But the fact they bought them and their model is to turn them into rentals, is a mechanical relationship, meaning that it has to go down of that stock. The one thing I'm trying to kind of caveat is that in a bigger market context, we might see more ownership units built on the edge of the city to make up for this loss of ownerships if the market is saying that we need about this share of each. So that's a little more complicated. Like if I look at all home ownership rates in Mecklenburg County, which is the bigger county that surrounds Charlotte, I'm sure we're not seeing that drop in ownership. We're not seeing the same drop in home ownership rates because they're building more ownership units. But these are these are different neighborhoods in different places too. So Frankie?
Hi there. I'm just curious what the demographic breakdown is in Charlotte compared to Colorado. What you described with maybe Black populations being pushed out of the city into suburbs. I don't know that that's a similar experience to what we have in Colorado. So I was just curious if you have the demographic breakdown by race, so we can look at that into Colorado's data.
That's a great question. That's one of the things we want to take as nationally is because if we look at like Atlanta and Charlotte, where have had the highest amount of this institutional investors, that trend is common to both of them, in my understanding, but there's very large kind of African American communities there. I mean, like 20, 30%, 30 even +%. I mean, it depends on how you define the city and so on, but it's quite a bit larger. Of course, Colorado is not nearly those numbers at all. And I would think Hispanic would be more of a kind of interesting, at least in North Carolina until more recently, the Hispanic community wasn't nearly as sizable or as in terms of the minority community. So I think that'd be interesting in terms of Colorado to look at that Hispanic share too.
Agreed. Yeah.
But yeah, so yeah, part of, like I said, one of the things we don't know for sure, is this just like urbanization trends, urban suburban kind of trends that are why African American communities are really being targeted by these institutional investors, or is there something else about those neighborhoods that institutional investors like? Maybe these neighborhoods are not as good at potentially preventing or doing something else that would influence their decision to buy there. Who knows? So awesome. These are great questions. Thank you for interrupting me. I like it. Okay. So one thing we do, like I said, we look really close by and we say, what happens to like home prices right around these institutional investors? And I'll show you like a figure that shows this in a second, compared to homes that are a couple blocks away. Okay, so it's like pretty, like these neighborhoods are pretty similar. We're not gonna see much else change between them, but I think it has a nice kind of flavor of, we can think about it as this somewhat of a causal story, meaning that it's not just a kind of a correlation. And then we also see some of the things that we might associate with potential social spillover, the loss of home ownership. So there's a large kind of academic literature, and this has been used to justify a number of our federal tax credit subsidies or kind of tax credit policies around home ownership through mortgage interest deductions and so on. We see higher crime. We see more what is called nuisance code violations. So violations for things like, tall grass, junk in your yard, other things like this, noise complaints, and then less building permits. So less activity in terms of renovations. So new roofs, plumbing, renovation, things like that. We also even use some stuff on political participation because we have individual level voter data. Okay. So part of the reason North Carolina is the focus of the study is the data is really good. So in general, I would give you the pitch. If you want good analysis of anything, just make good data available. Okay. Like I did tell you, is that identifying institutional investors is a real pain in the butt. And it depends on where you're trying to find them. Like I told you, there were 6 major players. Okay. There's a couple smaller players too, but the public REIT ones are the easiest to identify. The private ones are a lot harder, and it varies by state. Okay. And the reason is that every single institutional investor uses an LLC to purchase the property. Okay. And so here's a sample of what we found for Invitation Homes, one of the biggest players. And you can see the highlighted yellow is showing you that it's all Invitation Homes is the actual owner. If you go to the second column, the owner raw column, this tells you what it's listed in the property records as the owner. Okay. It's like unrelated to anything you could imagine. It's not even related to the address. It is all kinds of variations. And they all have different spellings and commas and punctuation. So it's actually it's a little bit manually intensive sometimes to figure it out, because you have to go through and figure out what elements you need to match on. And so this is, something we worked on with some reporters in North Carolina, and involved a pretty extensive kind of story. It involves having really good property records. So you need annual snapshots of all the properties in a county. Okay. And so that's something that is an important part that, for one county, it's quite easy to get tax assessor record. But if you're talking about a whole state, it gets a lot more involved. There are private companies that sell this data. And so I've actually purchased this data through a private company to do this nationally. There's also, a lot of times you want to use this, the North Carolina Secretary of State. Now they're actually provide this information. They'll provide the corporate owner for different LLCs. So a lot of times you can most of these you can directly match to invitation homes through the North Carolina Secretary of State. In some cases you can't. And then there's other kind of ways to go about doing this. Court records are useful because whenever one of these institutional investors evicts someone, we can then figure out the subset, we can figure out which LLC is matched to the actual corporation. And so there's all kinds of there's lots of these kind of stories too. One thing, I was gonna say, they do evict more, so that's why sometimes that works too well to figure that out. But just to be said, I haven't looked for Colorado. I'm not sure how easy it is to do this in Colorado in terms of LLCs. But we could discuss that in the future if that's something you guys want to look into. But this is the first step on why it's in general, if you want to really figure out what the scale of this, you have to first figure this out, because otherwise we just don't know which of these are the corporate entities and which of these could just be, a local flipper or someone who does a local rental might use an LLC also just for tax and other reasons. Okay. The data we use for this study is based on 4 major data sets. They're all kind of administrative data sets. And they're all actually public records. So none of this requires any, data use agreement. These are all based on publicly available data. So you can see tax records, crime reports, building permits, and code violations. I'll give you a sense of what those nuisance code violations are. That's what we'll focus on, and building permits for renovations. The voter data is interesting, is that for the state of North Carolina, they require that the state has to take annual snapshots of voter rolls. So we know where every year where everyone's registered to vote based on their address, and some other things like political affiliation, race, age, and so on. So we can get some interesting dynamics about, for at least this subset of people, if they're more or less registered voters, kind of in response or before and after these institutional investors come into a neighborhood, as well as some other demographic stuff if they are registered voters. Okay. Perfect world, we'd have some like census data, individual census data, we could do this, but that is another big task to do. Okay. So at least in our study period from 2011 to 2021, this is what it looks like in terms of the actual concentration of these institutional investors in Mecklenburg County, which is mostly just the city of Charlotte. And so you can see that, at least in our data, 2011 barely happens, but as it goes on, we see substantial kind of investment activity. Okay. And you remember, like, interest rates kind of change somewhat. One of the things I think you will find is probably a connection between some of the interest rate activity and institutional investors, because as interest rates are a lot higher, institutional investors have a real advantage because they're not financing these purchases. And so they can offer more money in terms of affordability than an individual owner can. But one thing you'll see, there tends to be activity across the different time periods where, a lot of these investors will invest for most of the years, but have heavy years where they're doing a lot more. One thing it's not really clear to us yet why what their actual strategy is. And so I'm trying to talk with these different institutional investors to see, like, what is your actual strategy for doing this? I'm only heard kind of anecdotally how they approach buying properties. So I think that's some interesting stuff. I'm talking to you. Go ahead.
And to confirm, so this is purchases, but it's gross purchases as opposed to net. So sales are absent from this. If an institutional investor sold, that would not show up here.
Yeah, that's correct. That's correct. And like I said, I can't imagine this would look very different even if we did include the sales.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. I know there's only so much you can ask from a graph, so I just want to make sure in my mind I knew what I was looking at.
Yeah.
So
Think
thank
about
you.
you want to think about the gross flow kind of thing. Yeah, you don't, it's not net. But like I said, I don't think there's much to take out. Okay. And you can kind of see the purchase, like on the bottom here, the share of yearly transactions purchased. So this gives you the share. So like in 2013, 8% of all transactions were purchased by institutional investors. 2021 was over 9%. So that gives you a sense of how it flows over time. I think 2022 is probably another big year. I just didn't get that far in the data.
It will be interesting to see this with a change in the interest rate environment.
Yeah, I know. I think it's a good I think at some point I want to do this nationally because I want to get a bigger like sample and see what it's kind of these scopes are looking like. But I agree with you completely. I want to see how much it relates to interest rates. Elizabeth?
And are you able to tell just like the total number? So like, I know that this is share of purchases, but just even what that is as a share of total housing units that are owned. I mean, I guess you know the denominator, right?
Yeah, we do. I mean, like, so we try to do a share of transactions because that's what's possibly they could buy potentially. So that's kind of how we framed it typically. I mean, I do have some figures in my paper in the appendix where it gives you the raw numbers per neighborhood. So that could be helpful for thinking about it. This gives you the total number of properties being like, so it's over 3,000 in 221 and, almost 2,000 in 2013. So we do see some sense of the overall volume per year.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, this is where kind of how it evolves over time. So in general, I used to have like maybe it has the actual number here too. Oh, I didn't put this in the slide, but I have it in the paper. But you can see this is the share purchased by institutional investors in a census block group. So you can see, I mean, I don't expect you to know this, but in Charlotte, this is like the downtown area. So right here in the center where it's the most kind of the census block groups are the smallest. That's the downtown area. The south part is the kind of white, wealthier part of town. And the kind of middle ring where all this activity is happening is traditionally, a lot of like what was old manufacturing or more blue collar housing. And so that's where they're kind of doing most of their activity. And would it say these more inner suburban and some of the suburban areas. And you can see this kind of as this gets, different colors and approaches yellow, this is where more and more of this activity is occurring over time. And so some places we're talking 25%, but it's approaching 50% in some. So some of them it can be a sizable share of transactions. We look at this is one of those things where we kept seeing this pattern for these Black neighborhoods. And so we do see overwhelmingly that when we split up all of our census geographies based on above and below median Black share for the county, this is what we find, right? So I think the median share, depending on census block group versus census block, because it's a pretty segregated city, you're getting probably somewhere around 15% or so is the median Black share. And so, overwhelmingly, it's going to be above that, which I think is pretty interesting, considering if we know there's a real correlation between race and income. And so ownership neighborhoods are typically whiter in general. So this is an interesting pattern. One thing we do to like really think about what else, or what if we were trying to say what else predicts where an institutional investor puts their money, these are the attributes we find. So properties built in the 90s and 2000s are overwhelmingly what they're targeting. Homes within 1,000, 2,000 square feet. So these like not the smallest, but smaller homes. Interesting, they're not targeting low quality or rundown homes. They're average or above average quality in our data. That was surprising. We thought they really would target these foreclosed or rundown homes. So it's not a story of them buying up homes, fixing them up in any way. So that doesn't seem to be part of the story. Even when controlled for lots of other things, there is a correlation, this connection between percent Black and if there's an institutional purchase. And so we're not sure why that is, but it's an interesting kind of association. And then homeowners associations are negatively correlated. I think this is one of the, this is an important one because it's saying that for the census blocks, we find that we can identify as homeowner associations, so that there's some type of, the mortgage records indicates that if there's a homeowner association there. we find that institutional investors are less likely to invest in them. Tio?
By the way, absolutely fascinating stuff that you're finding here. One question that came to mind that actually spurred off of Elizabeth's question, which is, again, part of what we're trying to understand is the extent to which there is a shift and what affects that shift is. So an institutional buyer purchasing a rental home it wouldn't seem to be as much of a big deal as an institutional buyer buying an owner-occupied home. And given that you're looking at a split, about a third of all homes are owner-occupied, or a third of all homes are rental-occupied, 2/3 are owner-occupied. In your data, have you looked at the profile in terms of when the institutional investors go to buy a home, how many of the homes that they're buying are already rental homes versus how many of those are owner occupied when the institutional investor bought it?
Yeah, so in general, most of what we found was they were actually buying these owner-occupied homes. So the vast majority of what they purchased during this data in this time period was overwhelmingly owner-occupied homes. There was some, we don't focus on these rental properties that they buy. Part of it is because we're not, it gets a little harder to figure it out because you have all these corporate names and LLCs. It's not always so clear when they bought it versus if they bought it from someone else, or if they just, what they'll do sometimes, the corporate entity will actually own it and they'll change the ownership records. They'll do like title changes, even though they still own it. And so one thing that goes on that makes it a little confusing, and we talk to these reporters who spent like years working on this also, and we've talked to other people, is that there's definitely some weird dynamic of them. They'll shift it from initially they'll buy it, they'll be in a North Carolina based corporate entity, and then it'll be shifted to a non-North Carolina based corporate entity. And it wasn't overwhelmingly clear why they did this. So it's one of those things where it's really hard to figure out, but it is an interesting question. We should expect no effect.
So there's actually corporate to corporate sales as well.
Well, we don't know if it's actually a sale, because here's the story. We see this change, but we don't see a corresponding transaction in the data. So it's a title change, meaning that, and that's where it's a little bit, maybe there's some type of transfer. It's just, we just can't get good information if it's a meaningful change or just purely a title change.
Thank you. I know it's a very, very specific detail, but it's just it's a question of the narrative of the corporate owners or corporations purchasing single-family owner-occupied homes and then moving into the rental market seems to be a major part of the study question here. And so to tease that out specifically is of interest to us.
Yeah. So one thing we do in the paper is we actually compare the impacts of these corporate landlords relative to what we could consider mom and pop owners. And we still see effects. We still see some effects from mom and pop owners. Right now, we're still struggling with the fact that our estimates are really imprecise, meaning that we're capturing different types of local flippers or local owners. And I'm not surprising. There's lots of, the local rental, like local landlord, I think is a very heterogeneous thing. They do lots of things. They flip homes, they rent them out, then sometimes they'll come back and live in them and then change it, And so I think it's a lot harder to know what they're doing. But it's a great question that we're always struggling to figure out exactly what's going on.
Yeah, in your report, or in your paper, excuse me, not the report, but in your paper, I was noticing that you're using home flippers as a proxy for the local investors. So I was really curious to know the magnitude of the change of the effect of these large institutional investors, the 6 companies that are the vast majority of what you're looking at, as compared to all the mom and pop investors, because there's obviously an impact that you're measuring, and it's just a question of what is the magnitude of the difference of that impact from institutional investors versus mom and pop landlords. It sounds like that's really hard to tease out right now.
Yes, and so I love you asking this question. This is exactly what we've been struggling to tease out. We just actually purchased some property level data on listed rents. So one of the things we're trying to do now is to really make sure that for these local landlords, are they actually turning them into rentals or not? And once we do that, I think we'll have a better sense of the difference between those two.
Dr. Billings, we had another question from Tom
Sure.
Billings. Tom, if you could
Yeah.
ask your question, please. Thank you.
Yeah, Doctor.
Please.
Has there been any research done on the migration, or what happens with the sellers? So are the sellers staying in the home ownership realm? Or are they moving up? Are they becoming renters? Any research there?
I would love to do research on that. I think it's a great question. Yeah. I mean, one of the challenges is that to follow the people, there's a couple ways we might be able to follow them. One is that if the seller is a registered voter, we might see where they re-registered their voting information. So then we can see where they moved to. The other way is through, if they buy another home, we could figure it out that way. But if they move and they rent, we don't always see that. It's hard to see that, but it's a great question. I'd love to know. It's not a satisfying answer, but
Yeah,
that's how these things go. Okay, I'm actually, I went way over my 20-30 minutes, I realized, but you get me into it. That's what happens. But I'll try to finish up so you can ask some more questions. So one thing just to show you that even when we look at properties, control for all the attributes, the size, the square footage, we even control for what neighborhood they're in, and inflation when the thing's sold, that these institutional investors are paying a little bit less. Right. And like I said, it's something to do with the type of transaction, likely, but they clearly are selecting maybe quite a little bit different homes in some ways too. Don't worry about the stuff on the bottom, but what I want to show you from this is that if we look at the prices of neighboring properties around institutional purchase, so if you look at this graph, this dotted line is when the institutional purchase happened. It happened pretty much in time zero. And you can see that prices in neighboring properties are pretty much unchanged. But once that institutional investor comes in, the nearby properties start to downward decline over time. And this is about 2% and about 4 or 5 years out. Okay. So these are right nearby, so neighboring properties, and this would be relative to properties that were a block or two away. Heidi.
Yeah. Do you have information about the demographic composition, or income composition of the neighboring properties? So my question is, are institutional investors coming into predominantly African-American neighborhoods purchasing properties in a segment of these sort of, like larger scale neighborhoods, and then that's causing a downward price effect on the African Americans living in close proximity?
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of like other demographic data, it's really hard, and we just don't have at this spatial scale. We do see, I mean, in general, we are seeing just neighborhood effects where we see prices decline, and other measures in neighborhoods decline also. So some of the broader stuff, we look at more neighborhood aggregates and say and a lot of times we'll use like there's a couple different definitions of the neighborhood we use, like a census block group or census block, or even Charlotte has a special their own they draw their own neighborhoods based on community input. And so even looking at those types of neighborhoods, we do see in general, as there's more and more institutional investors, that in general those neighborhoods look worse in lots of dimensions: prices, investments, so building permits, crime, voter participation, a variety of like nuisance complaints, things like that. So it does seem to have a larger kind of negative effect. The prices are kind of like a little bit about the fact that they pay less for a home than few other homes that sell nearby. The perfect comp is the home that just sold. So then it just leads to this downward price spiral. The other thing we do is we break it down by our sample. So you can see column 2. These are, in essence, you see how these are overwhelmingly in Black neighborhoods. So most of our sample you'll see in columns 2 and 3 are overwhelmingly in Black neighborhoods. That's 0.7% price decline on average in the post period. You still have the dynamics that it would go down a lot more in later periods. HOAs don't seem to matter for this price effect. So once the institutional investors, they do invest in some HOAs, so there doesn't seem to be any real story there. One thing that's interesting is that the later time period is where the effects are happening. So this is a time period where we've seen more activity. We've seen neighborhoods with more institutional investors. So it could be this story that it really takes, it's like a critical mass. Once a lot of this activity happens, then we might start seeing more and more people kind of exiting the neighborhood, and potentially these price effects start to decline. These are some other measures. We talk about crime, building permits. Just want to give you some magnitudes to these stories. in essence, if you look at this dependent variable mean, like 6 over about 617. So pretty sizable effect. Or 6 over 100. So 6% for nuisance codes, building permits, that's got to be what, 30% or so. 10% for crime. So these are not trivial effects. And then we even have voter stuff. We see like fewer voters kind of moving in. So in essence, this is all, let me just, overall, this effect is saying that over time, as institutional investors come in, the neighboring properties see people that are registered voters leaving and being replaced by people that are less likely to be registered voters. That doesn't mean that's necessarily, and just if we think that people are more involved in their neighborhood that are more politically active. So,
and
Elizabeth?
Stephen, can I ask, is this, and again, I'm sorry, because I feel like I'm asking the same question, but I just want to make sure, because I want to make sure I get the right interpretation of the data. So is this because of institutional investors or renter, single family rentals in general? Another way to put this is, I know that your paper is on a slightly different topic, but if you did this exact same paper simply on single family home rentals, do you think you'd see something meaningfully different, or is it that it's institutional investors as opposed to mom and pop landlords that are causing this?
Yeah, I mean, you absolutely, and it's kind of the same kind of story as before, in the sense that we're just not sure we are able to disentangle for those local investors which ones are making these kind of long-term rental or keeping them as rentals versus doing other activity. And so that's what we're trying to do as this research evolves. But you're right. Right now, we cannot disentangle. Is it a corporate landlord or is it just the converting to a rental? I think there is some sense it's got to be probably a little bit of both, because there is some at least some of the evidence so far, it is pointing towards that the institutional investors tend to be, I would say, probably worse landlords in some dimensions. They evict way more. They do lots. They also seem to invest less in kind of lots of things as potentially other types of owners. Okay. So as I went way over the time, but that's okay. So, here's kind of the highlights. The policy application, I think, is what you guys care about the most. At least from this, there does seem to be something about just the idea of losing home ownership that could be important. And that's, we know there's lots of incentives for that. What we've heard of, at least in this space, is that there are some HOAs that now require waiting periods before purchased home can become a rental. So that's an interesting kind of side of the story, is that there's like a 2-year wait period before you can turn a purchase into a rental. And so that, I think that those types of policies actually would prevent most of these corporate entities from buying the home, because they don't want to wait that long. There's also I've heard other debates on restrictions on these investors and what they can do. And so, right now we don't, there's potential benefits we're not always capturing. And then there was this big congressional House, 9246 that never went anywhere, but takes away some tax benefits to large investment firms. Avilia, is that right? Am I saying your name right?
Yes, Avilia. Do you think other type of renter protections would also disincentivize this type of ownership, eviction protection sort of stuff? Do you see anything in the literature data that would suggest
It's a good question. It's something we should probably put on there too. I agree. Yes. From this evidence, the idea of if it's hard to evict renters, or other types of protections for renters should have some of the similar effects. I agree. Yeah. I haven't seen anyone write on it specific in this context, though. Okay. So you guys have talked about the future research you want to do, which is great. I just need more manpower and time and so on. But these are all kind of interesting questions. Not just also like what happens to the sellers, what happens to, is this a benefit to people, the renters that move into these institutional rental units? I've seen one other paper. There's some other scholars, and I can give you a citation for that. They have a working paper that says that families that move into institutional, they focus mostly on these, there's some institutional investors that build these whole communities now on the edge of cities, and they talk about how these renters are able to access better schools, and that leads to better academic outcomes. So there is potential for that story too. But yeah, that's go. Please go ahead, Amelia.
Yeah, Yes, you also mentioned briefly that you're working on, or you purchased on a national data set
Yeah.
as well. I'm curious to know who owns the data set, where did you how did you purchase it, and how does the quality of it, how is that looking? Basically in
Yeah.
terms of, because your paper goes through a lot of work and you used a lot of labor to be able to clean the data.
Yeah.
What's your sense of working with the one you bought? Is that easier? Is it going to require a lot of cleaning as well? And
Yeah, so
how's that
we
looking?
purchased, there's a couple data sets out there. I mean, I have some grant money that we used for a previous project. We were able to purchase a data set from Atom. The other major players in this space, so ATTOM, there's a couple other players. CoreLogic is another big player in this space. Almost all, I mean, at one point Zillow was giving out free data to do this, which was great, but then they killed it. This was Z-Tracks program, which allowed
Z-Track shutdown. Yeah, that's too bad.
yeah, so I had to kill I used to use that, and then I just, they said that we weren't allowed to use it anymore, so that's what it is. But in general, they're all coming from county kind of tax assessor data. So I mean, they're just taking the time to collect all that. There's various kind of, I would say, across these data sets, they all clean them slightly differently, and there's some holes. I find that in bigger kind of, if you like, just imagine this, if you have a county that has good data that you can look up on their portal or their web portal, they're going to have good data in these data sets too. And so places like Mecklenburg County has great data, so that's really good when I buy from the private vendor, it's very same quality data. It's rural areas are really you're going to struggle with more in these data sets. But if you're talking more urban areas, which is really the focus of this stuff, it tends to be pretty good. In general, the data I purchased, I'm still in the process of integrating it all into the kind of master data set. And at least from what I've heard from my RA, who's diligently working on this, is that it seems to pretty good coverage and doesn't seem to have really any massive issues that they've come across yet. So I think it's pretty good. I mean, these data sets are over 50. They're like, it varies depending on what you can get from them, but they're over $50,000 to get the access to the data, so they're not trivial to buy. But they're pretty open in what you use it for, which is nice. They don't really restrict it. They don't restrict you to certain projects.
And do you plan on studying some of the impacts on rent? Basically, as you mentioned, it seems like once they hit a critical mass, certain things in neighborhoods would start changing. One of them could be they start having more market power. If family doesn't want to move too far, doesn't want to take the kids out of school, but all the homes are basically have a corporate ownership structure that might start changing the rental market a bit. Is that something that you plan on looking into?
Yeah, I mean, so the other data set I honestly just got the contract approved, just got the data yesterday, was from another company called Altus, ALTOS, and they actually sell what they've been doing for the last decade or 12 years. They have 12 years of historic data. They've been scraping every property that's ever listed on the web, pretty much. They have these web crawlers. They scrape all the data and they collect it. And so in that data set, you actually get property level data on rents. And these institutional investors like Invitation Homes, American Homes for Rent, they are very good about listing these homes because they want to rent them out. I mean, property management companies are renting them out. So my understanding, and I really haven't explored the data because I just got it, is that the coverage is pretty good on these types of properties. So one of the things we want to do, at least the very kind of limited sense, is say like, in general, they're going to be higher rents than apartments because they're homes. But what's happening to rental prices more broadly as these things come online? So like this could, maybe this is a nice supply of rental units that are helping renters in lots of ways for sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, my wish again, I know that you have a whiteboard full of wishes in terms of what you want to get the data. But I'm really curious to find to separate out the institutional, we're talking about the large institutional investors versus just the existence of single family home rentals. And it seems like we're not quite there yet, but again, that's the the frontiers of exploration. That's why you do these kind of studies.
Yeah, I mean that is absolutely a goal for this current paper that I'd circulate, this working paper. Like that's one of the things we are absolutely trying to do, because without that, it just leads you to not know much. Really, is it really a corporate ownership, or is it just being rentals? And those are very different implications for sure. So I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah, we're obsessed with figuring that out too. It's been harder than we thought, but we'll keep working at it.
So kind of building off of that, you know, like if you could make data wishes, because you had said earlier that, you know, obviously good data is important to be able to try and do any of this work. If data were to be collected differently or released differently, recommendations, ideas of what that would be?
You mean for Colorado or for more broadly everywhere, or what kind of missing data pieces am I missing more broadly?
I care more about Colorado, but I'm not opposed to other places.
Yeah. In general, I'd love to have better data on that tracks people over space, across space and time. Because one of the issues we keep finding is that, you know, I might know who lived there through the ownership records, but then the ownership records are, you know, if it's a renter, I don't know who's renting it. I don't know where they came from. I don't know where they're going. Maybe if they're registered voters, I see them once in a while, but not always, because renters have a pretty low voter registration rate. Owners are typically more like 80%, but renters are typically, if you're lucky, 40-50%. And so that's been an issue.
You know, just even getting back to what Teo was talking about, in terms of corporate owners versus other owners. I mean, recommendations, even how we keep records and are able to search records.
I mean, I would definitely think that this whole idea that you can anyway not disclose the corporate owner when you have an LLC for an individual property seems kind of ridiculous to me, that some states don't allow that. Some of the states don't disclose that. I think there's like there's a website that tells you which ones do it. And I meant to look this up, but I was caught up in a million other things today. I think it's Open Corporate's site, and this will tell you, I'll put the link here. Let me just grab it real quick to make sure I'm thinking of the right thing. I thought that's the one where it said, there's something like and I'll send it to you guys later, but it tells you like if LLCs are available at the state level. It's like, let me see. I'll send it to you later. I don't want to spend time right now.
Yeah.
So it's just raw. But it does say like state by certain states it's really easy, certain states really hard. And so that's one of the issues that can be problematic. Is that some places think it's that the corporations have a right to not disclose who owns that property. And so that's not ideal for doing this type of research for sure. It would also be nice to link it up. Like sometimes, you know, even individual, I'd love to know like mom and pop or local ones that they own multiple properties. That's really confusing too. And so that comes down to, these LLCs, do we actually see the actual owners? Just standardizing that process of ownership records would be nice. And the most transparent version of ownership records would be ideal. But, you know, beyond that, there's, you know, and I'd love to, you know, just in essence, I'd love to be a Scandinavian country where we just track everyone all the time. But, you know, that's for research purposes, but I know it's another issue I know.
Yeah, we've talked about that within demography. If we could just put like a scanner code on everyone, we'd know where they were and what they'd be doing, and
population estimates would be great.
Job, but
it's true. That's true.
All right, Heidi, last question.
I mean, it strikes me that if you had all the resources and the time in the world and you had access to tax data, to personal tax data, you could do all this, right? Like I could tell if somebody was taking the mortgage interest deduction and then moved and suddenly is not. I could tell if they have LLCs, you know, if they've got passive income through real estate. I mean, it feels like that would be an enormous exercise, right? But like, a lot of the stuff that we're talking about is there in some level because that's how people file taxes and pay taxes. But
yeah, I mean, if you've ever,
enormous undertaking.
So like the research I know that have done this. So like, you know, Raj Chetty and Nathaniel Hendren from Harvard, they did this. I mean, the backstory of all that is that it was this crazy process where they, in essence, for free, set up this whole system with the IRS, and Exchange got this data. But But to access that data is a whole undertaking too. It's not
Yeah,
trivial at
no,
all to get into.
absolutely. Yeah, yeah.
I mean, I'd love to. Yeah, yeah. I mean, I agree. If we really wanted to, with the IRS data, you would be pretty certain where everyone lives, what they're doing, renters versus owners, for sure.
Assuming
Yeah.
they file. Yeah, right. Assuming that's
Yeah,
true.
yeah. No, I totally agree. I don't know, yeah, yeah. Absolutely, yeah. But yeah, I don't know. Yeah.
Well, Grace, I want to be cognizant of the time. I know it's after 2 o'clock, and I want to thank you so much, Stephen, for spending that time with us. We have recorded this for others then that weren't able to attend, and as a task force, we may create some additional questions that we might try and pick your brain on, since you've done so much work in this area. But I do want to really appreciate you taking the time to meet with us. Thank you so much. And I think with that, we'll probably end the meeting.
Awesome. Thanks for great questions. Appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your work.
All right.
All right.
Take care, everyone.
Thanks,
Thank you.
guys. Take care.